Field Marshal Erich von Manstein stood at the observation post, binoculars pressed against his eyes, scanning the frozen horizon of the Ukrainian steppe. March 1943. The world before him was white and silent, and then it wasn't. Across the snow-blanketed plains, flashes erupted along 15 kilometers of front. Not scattered bursts. Not the usual preparatory fire. A continuous wall of flame. The ground trembled beneath his boots. He tried to count the intervals between the explosions, searching for pattern, for rhythm. There were none. Just one unbroken roar, a sound so immense it stopped being sound and became pressure against his skull. His aide, a young captain barely 23, lowered his own binoculars. His hands were shaking. "Herr Field Marshal," he whispered. The intelligence estimates were right. Manson said nothing. He had commanded armies through Poland, France, the lightning victories of 1941 when the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. He knew what artillery preparation looked like. This wasn't preparation. This was annihilation. Industrial, methodical, relentless. Somewhere out there, 3,000 Soviet guns were firing in coordinated waves, and Manstein understood with absolute clarity that Germany was facing a war it had never learned to fight. The realization had been growing for weeks now, a cold weight in his chest that no amount of tactical brilliance could lift. 2 months earlier, Friedrich Paulus had surrendered the 6th Army at Stalingrad. 91,000 men stumbling into captivity. Another 200,000 already dead, frozen or starved or blown apart in the encirclement, while Hitler broadcast orders to stand, fast and wait for relief that would never come. Manstein himself had tried to break through. He had come within 48 kilometers of the pocket. Close enough to hear the desperate radio calls, close enough to imagine rescue, far enough to watch it all crumble. The Red Army had swallowed his relief force, then turned back to Paulus and tightened the noose. Hitler had promoted Paulus to field marshal the day before he surrendered. A message delivered with Prussian subtlety. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Honor demanded death. Paulus had chosen survival. Manstein lowered his binoculars. The barrage continued without pause. He turned to his aide. "Get me Zeidler, now." General Kurt Zeidler answered from the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. 8 months as chief of the Army General Staff had carved lines into his face that hadn't been there before. He had watched the Eastern Front crumble in slow motion, seen every strategic recommendation rejected, every tactical withdrawal forbidden. Manstein didn't waste time. "We need authorization to withdraw 1st Panzer Army behind the Donets. If we stay here, the Soviets will cut us off. We'll lose another 20 divisions. Silence on the line. Not confusion. Resignation. Manstein pressed harder. "Kurt, they're producing 24,000 tanks a year. We're producing 10,000. They're raising 100 new divisions while we scrape together battalions from training depots. This isn't defeatism. It's arithmetic." Zeidler's voice came back flat, exhausted. "I'll present it to the Führer." He did. Hitler refused. The 1st Panzer Army stayed in place. 2 weeks later, the Soviet offensive cut behind them exactly as Manstein had predicted. He launched a desperate counterattack, carved open a narrow corridor, pulled most of the army out alive. But all the heavy equipment stayed behind, all the fortified positions, all the supply dumps, everything that couldn't run fast enough. That night, alone in his tent, Manstein wrote in his diary with a hand that didn't shake, "We can no longer win this war by military means. The only question is how to end it before we lose everything." He wasn't the only one doing the mathematics. Heinz Guderian inspected a panzer division in April 1943. On paper, it should have had 200 tanks. He counted 73. Production couldn't match losses. Across the entire front, the ratios were staggering. 3 Soviet tanks for every German one. Guderian sat in his field office and calculated it all with brutal precision. Soviet factories ran 3 shifts, churning out T-34s by the thousands. German factories couldn't match that pace. Not even close. Not even if every plant ran perfectly and the Allied bombing stopped tomorrow. He presented his findings to Hitler in May. Charts, production figures, intelligence estimates from captured documents and interrogated prisoners. Hitler barely glanced at them. "They cannot possibly produce this many tanks," Hitler said, waving dismissively at the carefully compiled data. "Where would they get the steel, the workers?" "It's physically impossible." Guderian pointed to the evidence laid across the table. "Mein Führer, the numbers are verified. Our panzer crews are fighting these tanks. They're destroying our divisions. Hitler's face hardened. Dummy tanks. Propaganda. You're being deceived. Our soldiers are superior. Our equipment is superior. Willpower matters more than numbers. Guderian left the room knowing further argument was useless. He returned to his headquarters and sent orders to divisions that didn't have enough tanks, enough men, enough ammunition, knowing exactly what the result would be. Knowing men would die because reality couldn't penetrate the walls of the Führer's certainty. Kursk would make the reality undeniable. Operation Citadel. Hitler's final offensive in the east. 2 massive panzer armies. 780,000 men. 2,700 tanks. Aimed at encircling a Soviet salient and restoring German initiative. The Soviets were waiting. 1.9 million men. 5,100 tanks. 6 defensive lines in depth, each one thicker than the last. The mathematics were brutal before the first shot was fired. Yet Hitler insisted. The attack began July 5, 1943. Within hours, the outcome was clear. The German advance stalled in minefields, anti-tank ditches, dense belts of artillery fire. Soviet reserves appeared faster than German intelligence thought possible. For every position taken, 3 more waited behind it. By July 13th, after losing hundreds of tanks and thousands of men for a few kilometers of scorched earth, the offensive was called off. Field Marshal Walter Model stared at the map showing the tiny salient they'd carved at such cost. He spoke so quietly his staff could barely hear him. "We can't do this anymore." The Red Army counterattacked immediately, sweeping west like a flood. Kharkov fell, the Dnieper line collapsed. Everything Germany had bled for in 1941 disappeared. Manstein requested permission to shorten the lines, trade space for time, pull back to defensible positions in Poland. Hitler refused. Manstein was relieved of command, replaced by Model, who would follow orders. But even Model couldn't hold back what was coming. June 23, 1944. Operation Bagration. The largest Soviet offensive of the war. 2.3 million soldiers. 5,900 tanks. 36,000 artillery pieces. All aimed at Army Group Center. German commanders begged for permission to withdraw, to save their armies before the trap closed. Hitler's response was always the same. Stand and fight. No retreats. No surrender. When dawn broke on June 24th, the horizon erupted. 36,000 guns opened fire in perfectly timed waves, a rolling wall of thunder that stretched across the entire front. For 2 straight hours the bombardment never paused. Not 1 second of silence. Not one break between salvos. It was the largest artillery preparation in human history. When it finally lifted, Army Group Center had ceased to exist as a coherent force. Then the tanks came. Endless lines of T-34s, hulking IS-2 heavy tanks, armored infantry in trucks and half-tracks, all pushing forward in massive, disciplined formations. This wasn't the Red Army of 1941, the one that had broken and scattered under German assault. This was a modern war machine. They had learned the Wehrmacht's lessons deeply and ruthlessly. Deep penetration, fast exploitation, encirclement, annihilation, and they executed it on a scale the Germans had never imagined possible. Within 72 hours, Army Group Center was in freefall. Entire divisions disappeared from the maps, overrun or cut off or simply dissolved under the armored avalanche. Soviet tanks appeared behind German headquarters before forward units even knew they'd broken through. Communications collapsed. Commanders gave orders to units that no longer existed. General Hans Jordan, commanding the 9th Army, watched his front unravel like wet paper. Soviet tanks materialized behind his command post. His supply routes vanished. Every message brought worse news than the last. On June 27th, he requested permission to withdraw. Hitler denied it. The next day, the Soviets closed the trap. 70,000 men swallowed in a tightening ring of steel. No fuel, no ammunition, no escape. Jordan attempted a breakout. It collapsed within hours. The Soviets had perfected the science of encirclement. Surround fast, seal tight, bring up the artillery, crush the pocket. Jordan's army held out for a week before surrendering. 70,000 more German soldiers gone. And it was only one pocket among many. Army Group Center had 4 field armies. By mid-July, 3 had been wiped from existence. 28 divisions obliterated. 350,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. In 60 days, the Red Army advanced 600 kilometers, retaking Belarus, smashing across Poland, reaching the Vistula River. Soviet scouts could see the rooftops of Warsaw. In East Prussia, Heinz Guderian sat in his new office reading casualty reports. He had been appointed chief of the general staff after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July. The conspirators had wanted him to join them, even to lead the army if Hitler died. He had refused, not from loyalty. He had little of that left. But because he was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. Even when those orders came from a man dragging the nation into the abyss. Now, tracing the shattered remains of Army Group Center on the map, he understood exactly what the plotters had understood. Germany's war was over. Not struggling, not troubled. Finished. The only question left was how long the dying would continue. He requested a private meeting with Hitler on July 31st. He brought everything, maps showing the collapsing front. Casualty graphs plunging into catastrophe. Intelligence reports on Soviet strength. And then, choosing every word with surgical care, he said what no other general had dared say. Mein Führer, we must seek a political solution. The situation in the East is untenable. If we continue like this, the Soviets will be in Germany before winter. Hitler stared at him with cold fury. Are you suggesting surrender? I'm suggesting negotiations, Guderian replied, keeping his voice level. A separate peace. Perhaps with the Western Allies, or even with Stalin. Anything that prevents Germany's total destruction. Germany will never surrender, Hitler snapped. We will fight in the streets. Every German will fight. Every city will be a fortress. Guderian tried once more. We have no soldiers left. We're forming divisions without tanks, without artillery. 16-year-old boys and 60-year-old men cannot stop the Red Army. Mein Führer, the numbers. Numbers. Hitler shouted. Always numbers with you generals. You know nothing of will, nothing of destiny. Germany will win because Germany must win. Guderian left the room knowing the truth. Hitler could not be convinced. No one could convince him. He lived in a world where belief defeated tanks, where will defeated artillery, where German determination defeated Soviet millions. Reality no longer entered the bunker. But the soldiers in the field had no choice but to face reality every single day. General Gotthard Heinrici held the line in Poland in late 1944, one of the Wehrmacht's finest defensive commanders. He wrote a letter to his wife, smuggled out by a trusted officer because it could never pass military censors. In it, he said what he could never say in any official report. We are fighting a war we've already lost. The soldiers know it. The officers know it. Only the leadership refuses to see. We hold a position for a week, lose 1,000 men, then fall back 20 kilometers and hold another. The Soviets keep coming. Endless men, endless tanks, endless guns. We kill them by the thousands, it doesn't matter. They have millions more. He admitted something else, something that haunted him in the dark hours before dawn. I don't know how to tell my men to keep fighting when they already know how this ends, but he kept fighting anyway. Not to win, to buy time. Time for refugees to flee west. Time for civilians to escape what everyone feared would come when the Red Army reached Germany. In January 1945, the Soviets reached the Oder River, 60 kilometers from Berlin. The front stabilized only because the Red Army paused to bring up supplies for the final blow. In the capital, Hitler held daily briefings in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Generals laid maps on the table showing divisions that didn't exist anymore. Hitler issued orders to phantom armies. He demanded counterattacks from units with no tanks, no ammunition, sometimes no actual soldiers. His commanders nodded, saluted, returned to their offices and quietly ignored the impossible orders, sending out directives that might actually save a handful of lives. General Theodor Buss commanded the 9th Army on the Oder. In early April, he tried counting Soviet artillery pieces firing at his positions. He stopped at 3,000. He tried counting infantry divisions advancing toward him. He stopped at 20. He knew what was coming. He knew he could not stop it. On April 16th, the Soviets began their final offensive. 7,000 guns fired for 20 minutes straight. The blast pressure alone ruptured eardrums. Then came the tanks, thousands of them. Then the infantry. Hundreds of thousands. Buss's army held for 3 days. Then it shattered. By April 21st, Soviet shells were falling inside Berlin. By April 25th, the city was surrounded. In the bunker, Hitler ordered non-existent armies to relieve the capital. Generals could only stare at the map. There were no armies, only fragments. Clerks with rifles. Invalids pulled from hospitals. Old men given Panzerfausts and pointed toward Soviet tanks. Hitler still believed help was coming. When General Helmuth Weidling was ordered to hold Berlin until these phantom forces arrived, he finally said what everyone else had been avoiding. Mein Führer, these armies do not exist. Hitler refused to accept it. You will hold Berlin until the relieving forces arrive. We have 3 days of ammunition left, Weidling said quietly. Many of our defenders are old men and children. You will hold. Hitler repeated. Weidling saluted, returned to his position, and organized the defense of a doomed city with whatever he had left. On April 30th, Hitler shot himself. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. On May 8th, the war in Europe ended. In prisoner of war camps across Europe and Russia, German generals were interrogated. Allied officers asked them the same question again and again, trying to understand how it had all happened, how it had gone on so long. When did you know the war was lost? Manstein answered slowly, carefully, as if each word cost him something. After Stalingrad. We could still win battles, but we could not win the war. The ratios were impossible. Guderian was more precise. At Kursk, when our last chance at initiative failed, everything after that was just retreat. Model never answered. Surrounded in the Ruhr pocket, he took his own life rather than surrender. His note reads simply, I cannot face what comes next. I cannot face what I have done. Paulus, the man who surrendered Stalingrad, lived until 1957. When asked when he knew Germany was doomed, he didn't hesitate. November 1942, in the Stalingrad pocket. When I counted the Soviet divisions surrounding us and did the mathematics. We were already dead. We just hadn't stopped moving yet. Why didn't he surrender earlier? Paulus looked away. Because I was a German officer. I believed in duty, in orders. I believed maybe Hitler had a plan. I believed in things I should not have believed in. He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was barely audible. I realized it too late. Did he regret surviving? Every day. I should have ended it in Stalingrad. I should not have lived. I should not have followed orders that should never have been given. Across archives in Germany and Russia, the same truth appears in letters, diaries, interrogations, memoirs. The generals realized the war was lost in stages. Stalingrad for some, Kursk for others, Operation Bagration for the rest. But in the end, they all knew. They just couldn't say it, couldn't tell Hitler. Couldn't tell their soldiers. Couldn't admit it even to themselves. So they kept fighting, kept retreating, kept issuing orders. Kept feeding men into battles that no longer mattered. And because of that silence, because of that obedience, because of that failure to act, millions more died for a war that had already ended, for a cause already lost, for a leader who preferred Germany burn rather than surrender. That is what the German High Command knew when they realized they could not stop the Red Army. Most said nothing at all. And those who finally spoke, years later in the safety of captivity, said only this. We knew, we all knew. And we kept fighting anyway.